It is also my pleasure to introduce Professor Helen Tilley, who kindly accepted to join us today in this discussion. Helen is a professor of history and law at Northwestern University in the US. Her research examines medical, environmental, and human sciences in colonial, post-colonial Africa, including their synergies with legal, economic, and global history. Among her works, it is the classic in the history of science, Africa as a living laboratory, empire, development, and the problem of scientific knowledge. Today, she will talk about one of her latest articles, Traditional Medicine Go Global, which is part of an outstanding volume published on the journal Osiris on therapeutical properties, global medical cultures, knowledge, and law.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I did this more as a dialogue, and I've done partly because the talk is based on a published piece that I've already done, and I wanted to do a little autobiographical introduction because there are some really interesting synergies between Graham's biography and mine, and also some complementarities around the different parts of the world that we specialize in. So a little bit about my autobiography, which the older I get, I'm more willing to talk about because I have job security. But I was born on the island of Oahu and was exposed very young to indigenous sovereignty movements, just from my mom actually was an activist and organizer and a musician. So I met a lot of indigenous rights groups as a very, very young person. And then again, in my 20s, when I went back to Oahu as a trainer of organizers. So I met a lot of young teen and college age students who were doing environmental and social justice work on the island of Oahu and who were part of some of the sovereignty movements. At a very early age, I also became interested in the history of science and ended up doing 2 degrees in the history of science. But in between my 2 degrees, I had years, almost 8 full years of experience in the real world, again, doing social justice and environmental justice work with a variety of organizations. So I actually attended 2 meetings in Malaysia, Penang, Malaysia, in 1993 and 1994 on the heels of the UN Conference on Environment and Development, where I learned more about the Third World Networks organizing on trade-related intellectual property rights. I took part in this massive conference where Vandana Shiva, an Indian activist and physicist who popularized the phrase, the word biopiracy, where she was just sort of beginning some of her campaign work to popularize that idea. It was a couple of years before that book came out. And people were also talking about the legal models of community intellectual property. And the reason I bring this up is that again, I've just recently, I'm not really a professor of law. I was recently given a courtesy appointment in the law school at Northwestern, but over the last 15 years or so, I've read more actively in legal scholarship, both law and society work, and also the scholarship of law professors. And I've seen a serious disconnect between the way law professors often talk about traditional knowledge and traditional medicine as legal categories, as categories of policymaking, and the way those categories emerged. And I know this from unfortunate, assiduous research in archives and primary sources and a kind of genealogy that sort of nicely complements Graham's. And one of the things I learned very early on is international law and the way it's taught is deeply unfortunate because legal pluralism and the scholarship on legal pluralism helps us appreciate that at any one time in any one place, there are always multiple jurisdictions. And that there is this sort of perception, especially in powerful countries where people are trained in Britain, France, Germany, the United States, Canada, Japan. In those powerful countries, there is a perception of there's domestic law and there's international law. And then they'd have to, well, what is international law? Europe. And it's all Europe all the time. And that's accurate to a point, and it raises the question of the misnomer of international law. But what it doesn't get at are transnational circulations of laws in which empire plays such a big role, and the history of empires plays such a big role. So Graham has given us a sense of the history of settler colonialism in the Americas, but it also doesn't help us understand the site-specific plurality of jurisdictions and competing jurisdictions, legal jurisdictions. And I offer these as sort of prefatory remarks because I spent about 8 years working on this edited volume on therapeutic properties, in which we brought together legal scholars, anthropologists, sociologists, and historians to really grapple through shared vocabulary that different disciplines used often in different ways. And I'm one of those people who likes to live in the crossroads of disciplines, because you see the silos and the blind spots of disciplines and how those blind spots are treated as perfectly okay, because you're then in a profession and you get rewarded by your profession. Doesn't matter if a historian says you're wrong, if you're a law professor, because historians, what do they know? And it doesn't matter if a law professor says you're wrong as a historian, or says you're irrelevant or too complex, because they're the ones who really deal with the bread and butter power issues and policymaking. And there's a lot of that professional jostling, which impedes a more accurate understanding of the genealogies. And those are sort of my prefatory comments to the book I'm writing right now, which is a global history of traditional medicine called The Wisdom of the Peoples from an African vantage point. And I would say, why Africa? W.B. Du Bois in 1917 wrote an article on the First World War in which he argued that geopolitics and the scramble for Africa were in many ways the root of the First World War. And yet already in 1917, that history was being erased. And he said, there are those who would write world history and leave out this most marvelous of continents. And so that's sort of been the pivot point of a lot of my own training. I have 2 degrees in the history of science, and then my final degree is in imperial and African history. And trying to get those 2 sets of disciplines to talk to each other is actually a lot harder than you might think. So the African axis has a real pivot point in a historical puzzle. And I'll kind of give away the game here. I'm gonna say something very specific about the Convention on Biodiversity that was codified at the Earth Summit in 1992. The Convention on Biodiversity was one of the first pieces of international law, treaty, that multiple countries signed that recognized traditional knowledge. It actually codified it, it recognized it. There was a long 18-month to 2-year behind the scenes negotiation around which phrase to use and whether to use the phrase indigenous knowledge. And ultimately, it wasn't indigenous knowledge, it was traditional. That distinction mattered a great deal. And it was an African, a Ugandan, who insisted upon it. But the Pan-African negotiators were quite active behind the scenes. Again, I can put my own biography. One of the negotiators was at that meeting in Penang, Malaysia in 1994, and I got to hear the stories of their behind the scenes fights. And it's so interesting because I don't write about my own experiences, but it helped me understand the behind the scenes struggles, the geopolitical struggles. The reason I mentioned the Convention on Biodiversity in 1992 and the international codification in law of traditional knowledge, not indigenous knowledge, is because I've now figured out that you really could not have that late 1980s, early 1990s debate without decades of debate about traditional medicine first. And that was a genuinely transnational set of debates. But again, African actors were pivotal to the way it was introduced into global governance. So many years ago, I'm embarrassed to admit just how many, probably 15, I was reading a report that the World Health Organization published in 1978 called The Promotion and Development of Traditional Medicine. And I was reading along going, oh, this is interesting, it's a little dry, and then they said, here's how we define traditional medicine, and here's how we define a traditional healer. And I followed the footnotes, and the two definitions came from meetings that happened in Brazzaville, the Congo Republic, and Kampala in Uganda. And so I thought, this is interesting. How did the World Health Organization publish a report in 1978 that used definitions from meetings in African countries? Where's China in all of this? Because the secondary literature on even at that point, and this was again 15 years ago, so the secondary literature on the history of traditional medicine tended to start in China, certainly East Asia. Why? For good reason, because with the 1949 Communist Revolution and Mao's endorsement politically of what he then started labeling traditional Chinese medicine, his endorsement of that made a big difference within China. And by the 1970s, there were many people, many Americans in particular, and doctors who had spent time in China and would come back to the United States and sort of say, this is the country where it's happening, because things are being codified at the national level. There's policy from 1954 to 55 put in motion. There's English language translations in 1955 that start circulating more widely. So there are all kinds of reasons to think that China is pivotal. Turns out it wasn't. Why? Because the People's Republic of China didn't have a seat at the table in the World Health Organization. They were not a part of the conversations. That doesn't mean that they weren't a ghostly presence. They were. There were references in many of the annual World Health Assembly meetings. The WHO holds annual assemblies that convene people very early on in a very first world, second world, third world kind of dynamics. The diplomats started to raise the issue of China quite early and asked that it have a seat at the table. But interestingly, as I traced the different meetings of the assembly, only 5 of which between 1949 and 1990 were held outside of Geneva, where the WHO has its headquarters. In those assembly meetings, it was, again, African countries that put forward the first resolution on traditional medicine to the assembly for vote in 1969. So again, historians love these puzzles, or at least I do. How did that happen? Why did it happen? How do we explain this? And what did it mean? So the article that I'm sort of talking around, which is called Traditional Medicine Goes Global, historicizes the 1969 resolution and connects it to a meeting happening simultaneously within days of each other in Algiers, where the Organization of African Unity organized a Pan-African cultural festival. It just so happens that this was one of those years that the World Health Assembly held its meeting outside of Geneva. It was held in Boston. So within days of each other, the World Health Organization Assembly approves its first resolution on traditional medicine, and the Pan-African Cultural Festival approves a Pan-African Cultural Manifesto in which they say we need to promote and support traditional medicine, and we need to also protect the intellectual property of Africans. And they connected those two things as part of their top 10 priorities for the Organization of African Unity. So again, like, what intellectual property in 1969? What is it? What were they trying to do? So the research I've done has tried to really reconstruct the WHO side of the story, the Organization of African Unity side of the story, and the Pan-African side of the story, because as you know, whenever you deal with global governance, most parts of the world that aren't powerful are constantly dealing with the alphabet soup of the UN. So you have this constant need to understand the UN, to engage with the UN, and it's a many-headed hydra, or it's it's an octopus, however you want to think about it. It's an entity that has myriad threads all over the world. And those threads can be controlled with enough leverage and power. And so one of the things I realized, again, as I looked at the Organization of African Unity's charter, was that it was actually designed to be a decentralized organization. Political scientists often study the OAU as a centralized organization. Its charter explicitly prevented the Secretariat of the OAU from having much power. So it was decentralized. It was designed to have moving meetings. It was designed to ensure that no single state could control the agenda. It was designed to have extraordinarily radical campaigns from very early on that challenged global power structures and pursue reform agendas within the continent to kind of accommodate sort of a more pro-capitalist set of states, a more centrist socialist set of states, and then another sort of wing that was truly sort of embracing kind of a communist agenda. I'm oversimplifying, but I think the storytelling is useful because it's rare that multiple agencies within African countries are studied simultaneously. And one of the things I do in my projects, and one of the reasons they take so long, is that it's not just multi-sided, it's multi-stranded and multidisciplinary and multinational. So I realized that the history of decolonization was crucial to explaining how the World Health Organization took up these questions, and that African diplomats, especially as they organized in what they called an Africa group between about 1956 as the first years of decolonization began, all the way up through about 1973 to 1976, the Africa group coordinated behind the scenes in multiple venues to put different things on the table. It was uneven coordination. For those of you who have ever tried to do multi-sided coordinating, some agendas got dropped, some got picked up, some people were more vociferous, some would drop the ball. But if you study things simultaneously, you really see a concerted push. And what I found looking at those early years was that, in a sense, before you could have a campaign around traditional medicine and intellectual property, traditional medicine had to be seen as cultural heritage. And to understand cultural heritage, you had to go into the United Nations, UNESCO, Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, because it's really UNESCO that's putting that on the table. As an aside for Graham, I've done a lot of work in the International Labor Organization records, both in the League of Nations time and in the post-World War II time. And one of the interesting questions pre-African decolonization that came up was that indigenous, the definitions of indigeneity were defined often in the 1950s in international law to exclude the bulk of African peoples. And so there's a very interesting dynamic in international law, as you know, in terms of the very small number of people in Africa who are classed as indigenous according to international law. And then the ultimate irony of human history, which is that who could not be indigenous to Africa? So that's a footnote, again, at the fault lines of different continents, the Americas and the Atlantic world versus a Pan-African perspective or an Indian Ocean perspective. So when I went back into the UNESCO archives, I really was surprised, again, to see similar countries taking the lead. So I mentioned, you may not remember, but I mentioned that Brazzaville, Congo, was the country that was one of the two countries, Guinea and Brazzaville, Congo, were one of the two countries that put forward the resolution on traditional medicine in 1969. Well, it turns out that from the 1960, Brazzaville, Congo was a huge player in UNESCO, and it put forward a resolution that was approved by UNESCO's assembly in 1960 on copyright law. and the need for African countries to protect their cultural heritage and cultural works. Now, if you're coming into independence after several different European countries have colonized a continent, the question is, what constitutes a cultural work? Is it music? Is it a phonograph? Is it a sculpture? Is it a painting? Or is it your entire corpus of epistemological product over millennia? And I mean, again, I'm giving away the answer. The diplomats who convened at one of the first UNESCO meetings in Brazzaville in 1963 to define copyright law and cultural heritage insisted on saying our cultural heritage is everything. It is science, medicine, technology, and yes, music, and yes, art, and yes, all of these other things. What's interesting about the way different aspects of this history have been parceled out is that, you know, there's a fantastic book on the history of copyright politics in contemporary Ghana that sidesteps this history because it doesn't really matter. It's called, the title is this, The Copyright Thing Doesn't Work Here. You know, it's a fantastic book, but it doesn't recognize, because the author is not interested in that question, that the very concept of things like folklore being embedded in copyright law, folk meaning the people, lore meaning the norms of knowledge, literally was chosen in that 1963 UNESCO sponsored meeting in Brazzaville, Congo, to stand in for cultural heritage. And it was considered a revolutionary move that was also diplomatically strategic. And diplomatic strategy, partly because I have a background in organizing, I recognize, I see it. I cut my teeth on the Earth Summit and what was left off the agenda, and all the many things that the Earth Summit did not talk about. It would not talk about Indigenous peoples' rights explicitly. It very deliberately tried to narrow down to biodiversity and forestry and sort of a generic sustainability model. But, you know, behind the scenes, activists were really deliberately trying to put things on the agenda, including traditional knowledge. So I saw, in a sense, what diplomatic strategies look like and what multinational campaigners can achieve if they are really offering a concerted agenda, and the pitfalls, all the ego, all of the fault lines, the people who will get in the way of something succeeding because they don't like each other. And then it has ripple effects across a nation. So these are the kinds of things that have been part and parcel of my organizing history and my scholarship, and also of my teaching, because I really do like to recover what I consider more accurate stories in transnational and comparative perspective. But I also like to recognize hard-won victories and complexity in the past. I'm as excited as the next person at the idea that there could be a radical revolution, and I'll be like, rah, rah, let's support it. But I also know from direct experience that institutions like their own status quo. So it's very hard to actually change things. And when you see it in the published record, you want to kind of follow those threads. So I've talked a little bit about UNESCO. I've talked a little bit about the World Health Organization and the key issue of definitions. Let me say a little bit more about the Pan-African Cultural Festival. And I'll say a little bit more about folklore, the public domain, and the phrase know-how. You know, what does it mean to have know-how? So in addition to UNESCO's work, supportive work, sort of the Secretariat decided to support African introduced resolutions that were passed by the Assembly. They also wanted to produce model laws. So they developed model laws on copyright, and they also developed model laws on industrial patents. And what's interesting in both respects is that African diplomats in both cases for a model law on copyright for African countries, which then later became for developing countries, and a model law on industrial patents for developing countries, which was spearhead, 50% diplomats came from Africa. They were working behind the scenes to take this question of cultural heritage, all of our science, all of our knowledge, and embed it in model laws on patents as well. And that took the form of know-how, our people's know-how. So the section of the article in which I go into that is titled Intellectual Property for the People. You know, it was very much an ethos that people possessed expertise. Now, for anyone who knows the history of development and economic development, there is a massive body of literature on technologies and technology transfer. There's a massive body of literature on economic development in kind of third worldism. The slice I'm telling is a piece of the story I never knew existed, which was a kind of recognition or desire to protect, almost to set up a firewall around the entire continent of Africa with these model laws, because the economies were so small, because the revenue for states was already so small. And the very reality of poor states was vivid and clear to anyone who was trying to build a state, you know, run a new country. Say, you know, this is Ghana, this is Senegal, this is Mali, you know, this is Guinea. Like, imagine trying to actually have the scaffolding and the infrastructure, and you can put things in perspective. I start the article, and I'm not, has anybody read it? I'm not sure if anyone's read something. I start the article actually with the moon landing, because it's happening at the same time as the Boston World Health Assembly in 1969 and the Pan-African Cultural Festival in Algiers in 1969. So the moon landing was July 24th. On July 25th, the WHO passed its assembly resolution on traditional medicine. On August 1st, the OAU passed its resolution on traditional medicine and intellectual property. So it's a matter of days when this is happening. And I use the moon landing as an economic point of view. And to get back to this reading group, in a way, the principle of my own work is that you can never disentangle the history of industrialization and massive wealth accumulation in industrial parts of the world, and the history of impoverishment and dispossession, which Graham has already talked about. And the shorthand for this is, you can't disentangle the history of technosciences from the history of ethnosciences, because the moon landing was very vivid to participants at the Pan-African Cultural Festival. And they were aware of a technological asymmetry. And they were aware of desires and needs and aspirations for possessions, for economic development, for wealth transfer. I mean, there was a lot on the table at various international meetings in the 60s. They also had aspirations, legal aspirations, to protect what they considered theirs, including intangible heritage, which is another name for intellectual property, the product of their minds and their culture. And as you can see, the way I'm saying it, I mean, it runs the risk of getting essentialized very quickly, an Africanness to it. And that fault line, there are a lot of fault lines in the story I tell. And if you like the kind of what's the punchline for all of the problems, I sum up most of the problems in the last 2 or 3 pages of the article. So if you want to get to those, I'm actually not going to cover them now, but let me just go back to the moon landing. The moon landing had a budget of $25.4 billion between 1960 and 1973. The World Health Organization had a budget of about 730 million. So a 3% of the moon landing. So just the sheer, I mean, when my family growing up, we say the chutzpah of the display of the Apollo moon landing, anybody who's running the World Health Organization will have that thought of, oh, if only we had that money. Imagine what we could do if we had that money for world health at the time. I mean, global health has become the norm. If you look at gross domestic product, which is also a production, which is also a relatively new metric for African countries in the 60s. In 1968, the United States had a GDP of 862 billion, and the entirety, every single country in Africa, including those still colonized, had a $47 billion income. So it's 5% of the United States. All of Africa, the GDP was 5% of the United States. South Africa made up 28% of that GDP. So the economic engine that it was apartheid South Africa is crucial also to understand. I'm only going to take about 5 more minutes. I like being able to tell it this way, and I appreciate the patience of those people online because I'm kind of just telling a story from my research. But the significance of decolonization and apartheid didn't become really evident to me, even though I would cut my teeth on anti-apartheid work on when I was in high school. I lived in Gainesville, Florida. The University of Florida had an activist group on defunding investments in South Africa, and my parents would take me to the marches and the rallies. So and then I went into African studies. I had a very deep appreciation of South African history and the history of segregation and apartheid. What I didn't really understand was just how many meetings between 1959 and 1963 that any African diplomat attended. They demanded a resolution on apartheid. That included the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization and its constitution espouses the principle that people have a right to health. And so if you're a new diplomat coming from an African country, you might say, do we really have a right to health if we're colonized? Do we really have a right to health if our rights are not fully recognized in the state of South Africa? And they answered in the negative. No, we don't have a right to health. So they wanted to expand the principles of rights to health to include the right to be free from racial discrimination and the right to be free from colonial domination, outside colonial powers. And that matters because by the early 1970s, they expanded that to say rights to health in African countries include a right to have access to our own therapeutic cultures, to the heritage that was destroyed in colonial times. Now, the funny dynamic and the recursive cyclical dynamic of imperial history is most of these diplomats came of age during colonial times when their countries were colonized, and therefore their direct exposure to what counted as traditional medicine or non-Western, non-colonial medicine often had a very colonial inflection to it. And it was already bounded by the laws of colonial states. And so one of the things, Graham talked a little bit about terra nullius, one of the things, which is a legal fiction, one of the chapters in my book looks at the many kinds of legal fictions around medical legislation that are established in the world, medical licensing laws that pretend that doctors and pharmacists and midwives are sufficient in number to really heal and help and save lives. I mean, it's a fiction, it's a myth. And yet every country in the world today has some kind of medical licensing laws that allow some people to practice medicine and others not. So I look a lot at who has rights to heal in the longer book that I'm writing. I've given you kind of a plate of a buffet from this book and some of the article that is kind of the abstract was circulated. So I want to come back to the issue of traditional knowledge and point out that by the 1970s, many different organizations in the UN system had already recognized traditional medicine. And Pan-African organizations were rife with support for it, including by 1977, the Pan-African Intellectual Property Organization, which already recognized traditional knowledge and traditional medicine as factors in protection around copyright. Without that legal campaigning and the legal push, there is no way that when you get the kind of 500 years is enough work across the Americas around the centenary or the 500-year celebration of Christopher Columbus, you know, and the kind of anti-Columbus movement, there's no way you would have the same kind of momentum for traditional knowledge had you not had all those other campaign efforts. It was multi-pronged and multifaceted. My book is featuring the African component because it was such a linchpin at so many key factors, but by no means was it the sole linchpin. The reason countries like China and India, and maybe even Bolivia, you could say, which have also set important legal precedents on different parts of this story, the reason those countries didn't find themselves at the forefront was because they're so big and they had such internal dynamics. I'll exempt Bolivia, I'm really talking about India and China. They had such internal dynamics around state building that kept them preoccupied, that some of the international geopolitical negotiations were less of a priority. Even at the Bandung Conference in 1955, I look in vain for references to traditional medicine or traditional knowledge. You go to different assemblies, you look in vain for it. But if you go to many of the African meetings, you find it, you know, it's low-hanging fruit, you find it. And yet this story has not been told. Even in the World Health Organization, even in UNESCO, the histories of these dynamics, folklore in copyright law, traditional medicine in the WHO, they've erased the African contributions, even in their own institutional histories, because it was so decentralized and so much like a social movement. It's very easy to erase the effects of social movements. You take the weekend, you forget the labor movement. Oh, the weekend, right. Oh, 48-hour week work days. I mean, the pandemic has really made me very conscious of labor organizing because the rollback of labor rights has been so profound. That editorial comment, I'll just say that is my show for the day. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions, or Graham can come up and we can do other things.